Okay, we're going to talk about Scrum, the future of work. We just released a first draft of a book to Random House editors on Scrum, mainly outside of software, in all kinds of different dimensions, everything from education to agriculture to government. But Scrum started in software, so I want to talk a little bit about how it got started. I also want to talk about the major change that's going on in the United States because a little over a year ago we had 20,000 Scrum jobs advertised on the internet, and today we have over 700,000. So things have radically changed in the United States. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Basically the reason that I think Scrum has been so successful is that it at least in the US, it goes right to the heart of the founding of the country, that people were interested in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the problem in the workforce today is that most people think that work really sucks. In fact, the only thing worse than work is being sick in bed for most workers. And that's because the workplace tends to suck the life out of people. It takes away their liberty, and it doesn't make them happy, it makes them miserable. So really at the heart of what Scrum is all about, where it came from, is to try to alter that workplace experience. And the origins of Scrum are very interesting because before I started the first Scrum team, I was working with a nonprofit organization that was based on the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh. The Grameen Bank and Professor Yunus, who started the Grameen Bank, noticed that World Bank would create these huge projects, 500 million euro dam. Sometimes they finished the dam, sometimes they didn't because it was a waterfall project. But no matter what happened, the people were still starving around the base of the dam. So Professor Yunus decided that he needed to get the money to the people and help them build small business. So we would get a small group together, maybe 5 people who were so poor they couldn't even feed their children. And he would coach them on coming up with a business plan. If we lended you 25 euro, could you start a small business? And someone would figure out that they could build a fruit cart and sell fruit in the town square. Another person would be able to buy a sewing machine and sell clothes. And when every person on the team had a plan, they loaned them 25 euro. And amazing things happened. We had all these case studies where a woman who couldn't feed her children all of a sudden within a few weeks had enough money for food. Once she had enough money for food, she had enough money to buy the children clothes. Once the children had clothes, she could send them to school. Once she had the kids in school, she started building a new house. So in 6 months to a year, their life could be totally transformed by bootstrapping themselves out of poverty. Now, I would go back to work during my day job was building software. And I looked at the software teams, and they were always late. They never had enough software. It always had too many defects. The customers were always upset. Management was angry. They thought they were bad developers. They put pressure on them, had them work overtime, work weekends. And no matter how much pressure they put on the developers, it just got worse. So to me, they reminded me of the poor people in South America. They had enough shoes. They had shoes and clothes, but they didn't have enough software. And the software they had didn't work. So I told the team, I said, I have this idea that I learned from the Grameen Bank that maybe we could bootstrap ourselves out of this mess we're in, and we could have more than enough software, and it would be really good software, and the customers would love it. And most of you have been under pressure and late for years. Would you like to try something different? It would be terrible to live the rest of your life in this miserable state. And so the team said, well, why don't we try something different? So many years later now, this year, this is a picture of Steve Bell on the right from the Lean Enterprise Institute. He's a certified Scrum Master. He went to the Center for Agriculture. The Grameen Bank now has a foundation that works in agriculture, healthcare, and he went to the Agricultural Center for Uganda, and they're using Scrum. And so he gave them a Scrum workshop so they can tune up their Scrum. And what he found out was working in agriculture, they were building mobile applications that teams could then take out to farmers. And on the mobile phone, they could look at the crops, and on the mobile phone, they could see what was wrong with the crops. And so they could diagnose the disease, and then the mobile phone would tell them what to do about the disease. So they had these great case studies of a poor woman farmer holding her baby saying, in the last 6 months, my crop yield doubled. And not only that, the Grameen Foundation had data on the prices for my crops in the city, and I realized they were much higher than I was selling my crop to a middleman. And so I used to sell my crops for 300 shillings a bushel, and now I sell them for 600 shillings a bushel. So now I have twice as much crop, I sell it for twice as much money, and I have 400% more cash. Okay, that's what Scrum is designed to do. And the poor farmers in Uganda are using it. So that's the future of Scrum in that little story. And they, at the end of the class, they sent me a picture. Thanks a lot, Jeff, for taking our idea and then putting it in a way that made it even better so we can use it for all our activities, not just software development, for everything. Another really important background for Scrum was the work in churches. My wife is a Unitarian Universalist minister, pastor in churches, and churches have problems in getting things done. They have problems with not enough money, not enough budget. They're kind of like the poor farmers in Uganda. So she implemented Scrum in 5 or 6 churches. But for the church, we scrummed the organization. We lined up their whole backlog, prioritized it, and then put their new initiatives at the top. And then every quarter, we wanted new features for the church. As Ken Swaber and I looked at this, a church is like a small business, and we realized that the way that we scrum the church, we could use to scrum a company. So when I started work with a venture capital group, OpenView Venture Partners, in 2006, we applied the church model to our venture companies. So we now have 31 companies invested. We have almost $1 billion to invest, and all of our companies do Scrum. And so that we have the church to thank for that. So it's really interesting, the roots of Scrum, where they come from. After we started working in the venture group, and we have a Polish company, OpenE, that's one of our companies, so I've been in Poland before working with them. The CEO of the venture group realized that Scrum would make anything twice as fast. So he said, we're going to use Scrum for everything. So they have about 6 teams that support companies that we invest in. They have an investor team, a search team for companies for investments, a finance and administration team, a recruiting team, so many teams, and they run weekly sprints. After they had run about 3 months worth of weekly sprints, they had almost 100 sprints of data. And when they looked at the data, they found that the people that were working long hours were slow, and the people that are doing with Scrum well, their peak of production was something less than 40 hours. So Scott Maxwell, the CEO, drew this curve for me, the Maxwell Curve. He says, we need to get everybody working normal work week. And he pulled the whole company together and said, okay, no more late hours, no more weekends, and everybody will double production. Now, when he implemented that, there was one group that didn't double production, the finance and administration group. So he said to them, you guys clearly don't know how to do Scrum, so we're going to split you up and put you on the fast teams, and you'll take your backlog with you, and they will show you how to do Scrum properly. So there is no team in the venture group that doesn't double velocity. In fact, on the average, they've all tripled it. Okay, so that's the basics of Scrum. You get twice as much done for half the work. Now, a lot of people aren't there yet. In fact, I noticed in Poland, there's still a lot of Polish developers that aren't that happy. Okay, so what we've done to try to deal with that, we learned in Sweden, a little company called Chris, with some of you may know Henrik Nyberg. He was using the happiness metric to run his company. He said, you know, the happiness metric actually is a better predictor of future revenue of our company, growth in revenue, than any of our financial metrics, because those measure history. They don't predict the future, but happiness will predict the future. And the reason is that happier people do better. So when I came back to Boston, I said, hey, I think we ought to implement the happiness metric in the company. And so the people immediately went to work, okay, what is this happiness thing? Let's look at the research on this. They found out right away that one of Harvard's most successful courses in the history of the university was a course on happiness that typically had 1,200 or more people in every course. And the Professor Ben Shahar, had written a book, Happier. And in the book, he had this quadrant. And what Professor Ben Shahar said is the problem is people have to act in a way that makes them happy today, but they have to do it in a way that's going to make them happy tomorrow. And the problem is they're not doing it. So, for example, I know in many companies in Poland I've seen you have people that are hedonists, particularly in the early stage. You know, we're going to hack away today, we'll have fun today. Tomorrow, that can worry about itself. And then, of course, tomorrow you have big problems with all this bad code out there. So then they bring in, you know, we come in as investors and we invest in a company, and now we need to bring in the management, and the management puts controls on the company. You know, you can't do that anymore. You have to follow these rules, and that makes everybody unhappy, and they turn into nihilists. They're miserable today. They're going to be miserable tomorrow. This company is going to suck forever. And we find most Scrum Masters have at least one person on the team like that. You know, no matter what you do, Ms. Scrum Master, this company is never going to get better. So that person is acting in a way that's going to keep them miserable forever. So when that happens, then development gets really slow. So then the management brings in the project leaders. Well, the project leaders want to get stuff done, you know, so they're usually in the upper left quadrant. They're the rat race people. We're going to work really hard. We're going to be miserable today so that tomorrow we're going to be happy. We'll get promoted. So, but then they get promoted, they have even bigger problems and bigger headaches. So they work even harder to maybe get even more promoted later, but it just never ends. They're not acting in a way to be happy today so they can be happy tomorrow, okay? So you need to get people moving towards the upper right quadrant. And a way to do that is with a happiness metric. We're going to talk a little bit about the biggest problem we have in Agile. In addition to not being happy, the reason a lot of Agile developers aren't happy is this chart. When Ken and I published Software in 30 Days, the CEO of the Standish Group, Jim Johnson, gave us his data on about the last 10 years. He had over 100,000 projects in his database all over the world. and he separated them into waterfall and agile. And what he saw was the success rate in waterfall was 14%. 86% of waterfall projects fail. Some of them, about half of that is total failure. The other half is late, over budget, unhappy customers. We have a major crisis in the United States right now because the website for signing up for online healthcare doesn't work. They can't sign anybody up. It's a huge political issue. The government shut down. That's what happens with bad waterfall. But if you look at the agile projects, you find that they're a lot better. The success rate is 3 times as high, 42%. The failure rate is 3 times as low, 9%. But we have a 49% bad agile. So obviously we're not doing a very good job of training and coaching people. How many people are trainers or coaches in the room here? A lot of you. We got all these bad agile people out there. So what are we going to do with that? Okay? Because agile should always deliver early. A good product owner gets on this value curve and knows that 20% of the features will deliver 80% of the value. So in our venture companies, we actually coach not just the developer, we coach the CEO. You want your chief product owner to deliver on that curve. And when they ship the first time, they're going to get feedback from the customers that's going to change their backlog. They're going to get on another curve, and you wanted to ship at the 80% that time. A good product owner should be able to do 3 shipments in the time of a normal project doing 1 in a way that achieves twice the value for the same cost. Now that's going to make your customers a lot happier, okay? So people aren't doing that. They're not shipping fast enough. They're not shipping often enough. They're not thinking clearly. Well, back in 1993 when we started Scrum, we were looking at the traditional waterfall implementation of our products. It was at Easel Corporation. They had developed the first 4GL language. IBM had sold that product all over the world, and we had really big customers, like Ford Motor Company had 1,000 IT workers using our 4GL language. And Easel acquired a Smalltalk company. Do we have any Smalltalkers in the room? Somebody asked me recently, how much impact did Smalltalk have on Agile? And I said, 100% of Agile exists because of Smalltalk. The first Scrum team was a Smalltalk team. The first XP team was a Smalltalk team. If you go and look at many of the leading thinkers in the Agile movement, they come out of a Smalltalk background. The reason being the environment was such that you could do very rapid iteration and very radical refactoring all the time was the common mode of operation. So they bought a Smalltalk company and said, we're going to build our next set of tooling in Smalltalk, and it's going to support large object-oriented applications. We're going to move beyond this traditional 4GL approach, and we're going to do a better technology. Now, when the team decided that they really wanted to implement the strategy from the Grameen Bank, I said, we can't just implement it by doing what we've done. We really need to do some research. We need to find out what are the best practices, particularly in software, because we're in software. We need to have a feeling like we're going to make the world a better place. I had worked not only with the Grameen Bank, but I had worked for many years with Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, nonprofit organizations, taking the money and the enthusiasm and the talent that we had in Silicon Valley and using it for the public good. And we knew that certain companies in the world had that mentality, and many of them had the best teams. And after researching, we found that Takeuchi Nanaka had done the best job, two Japanese professors, the best job of describing how these Japanese companies, really good Japanese companies, worked. We also examined all the research in the United States. We went through 30 years of IBM systems journals. We studied hundreds of other papers on productivity, software development. I was fortunate in that I had helped start up a company called iRobot. And by studying the robot architecture and how they worked, it really gave me a lot of insight into complex adaptive systems. And that gave a lot of insight then in how teams should work, how you could create a simple set of rules that would cause a team to bootstrap up into a high-performing team. The description of how to go about doing that I got from Alan Kay at Xerox PARC, the inventor of Smalltalk. I've mentioned Takeuchi Nanaka, but another major area of research had been Bell Labs. We had over 200 case studies published by Bell Labs on best projects in the world. So we assembled all that data and we started talking to the leading people in software development and tried to figure out, okay, what are we going to do? Well, the first thing we realized is that we needed an inspect and adapt system. And Ken drew that actually. He had his brother worked at DuPont. He worked with the leading process engineers at DuPont who had figured out why chemical plants blow up. And what they found out was there were two types of processes in chemical plants. One is a predictive process, like an assembly line, where you can predict what's going to happen. The other was an adaptive process, where some processes you put chemicals in a vat, they bubble and boil, and you don't know what's going to happen. You have to watch the vat. And the process engineers at DuPont had told Ken the reason the waterfall, 86% of waterfall projects fail is that you're applying a predictive process waterfall to a system that's not predictive. You need to apply an inspect and adapt cycle to software development because it's unpredictable. So I had at the same time had looked at the robotic technology and how they were getting robots to figure out how to self-organize and how to get smart using goal-seek behavior. It was the same thing. So when Ken and I put our heads together and formalized Scrum, all this thinking was behind that. In implementing Scrum, we were looking at what Alan Kay told us to look for. Alan had worked in a small team at Xerox PARC. During the 1980s, they created the first personal workstation, the first Windows, first use of the mouse, Ethernet, first laser printer, the first widely deployed object-oriented language. When Alan Kay presented this slide at MIT, I thought he didn't leave anything for the rest of us to invent. But he described how they did this. One team, 10 people, one team in a few years invented virtually everything you are using. So it was really interesting to try to understand how they thought about things. And what Alan told us was they only looked at extreme data points, impossible data points, the data points that scientists throw away because they couldn't be true. He says, only look there. Everything else is a waste of time. So we started looking. And the best paper we found for extreme performance was Takeuchi Nanaka's study of high-performing teams, particularly Japanese manufacturing teams, and particularly manufacturing cars. They wrote a paper for the Harvard Business Review that had this chart in it. They had been consultants, and they took senior management teams to the United States to visit companies. Fuji Xerox management went to NASA, and NASA described how they built the space shuttle. First, many years of building requirements, big documents handed off between silos, then many years of analysis, another big document, many years of design, many years of implementation, many years of testing. 12 years later, they finally deployed it. Then they had major problems with things blowing up. Okay, how do they build rockets today? How does SpaceX and their competitors build rockets today? You go into those companies, you'll see Scrum boards everywhere. So SpaceX deployed their first rocket. It worked the first time to dock with the space station in about 3 years. So very different today, and even NASA is using Scrum for a lot of things. But then people thought it was an example of best practice, this waterfall. So Fuji Xerox came back to Japan and implemented the NASA style, and they immediately find out the failure rate's 86%. Well, they were trained to do root cause analysis of why, so they did, and they found it was big documents handed off between departments. So they banned big documents. They said everybody has to work face-to-face, and they developed type B, kind of an overlapping strategy. They still had a requirements team, but they had to work face-to-face with the analysts. No more big documents, just good communication. At places like Honda and Toyota, they found type C, all at once building production prototypes in short cycles. Now, Takeuchi Nanaka called type B and C, they said it reminded them of the game of rugby, and particularly the Scrum formation in rugby. So they said, we're going to call this Scrum Project Management. So if you want to see how a real Scrum works, where would you go look? You'd really want to go look at Toyota. In fact, we'll talk about where the first documented Nanaka Scrum team happened in a minute. But when Nanaka looked at these teams, he noticed that they had 3 characteristics in common. 1, transcendent goals. They wanted to make life better for the customers and the workers. Autonomy. The people pulled their work, chose their work, decided how to do their work. They were given challenging goals by management. So the workers had freedom. And they worked together, cross-functional teams, learning together. So this learning and community built better workers, made them better people. Happier people, more successful people. Now, some years later, we were invited over to the Lean Enterprise Institute. The Lean Enterprise Institute was formed by 5 MIT professors to figure out why the Japanese were winning in the car business in the 1980s. And Professor Womack, who led the institute, wrote the first book on Toyota, the machine that changed the world. And in that book, it describes how Taiichi Ohno, the founder of the Toyota Way, visited General Motors and Ford, came back to Japan, and he said, these specialists on the line in General Motors are creating huge amounts of waste. So he came back to Japan, and he says, okay, all you specialists, we're going to form a cross-functional team, and you're all going to help each other do their work. And we're going to get rid of the foreman at General Motors, who is the manager of the team, who tells people what to do. We're not going to have that. The team leader is going to be a member of the team that helps the other members of the team do the work. And as soon as he got that running, he started continuous improvement. How can we, on regular cycles, continuously improve? Now, I was very interested because Takeuchi Nanaka wrote a book on Toyota, and in the book, they don't mention the word lean. They never talk about lean. It is not a Japanese word. It is not even a Japanese concept. They don't even think that way. So I said to the Lean Enterprise Institute, how come Takeuchi Nanaka are looking at the same teams you're looking at, and they call it Scrum, and all you guys talk about is lean? And they said, well, they drew the yin-yang on the board. They said, Taki Tanaka, you're looking at new product development, knowledge generation, which is done by Scrum teams that are lean. We're over on the assembly line that's run by these cells. If you look at the cell, it's a Scrum team. It has a Scrum board. But the lean stuff, lean for us means the techniques they're using on the manufacturing of the assembly line. That's what we call lean. But it's the same team doing the same stuff. It's two sides of the same coin. And the CEO of the Lean Enterprise Institute, who started the first plant at Toyota, showed us the book on lean product development. He said, Jeff, this is the book. It's how Toyota does it. Take a look at the first chapter. In there it describes it's done by Scrum teams. They have an entrepreneurial system designer. The description is a Scrum product owner. They run by cadence, pull, and flow. They have a sprint cycle like Scrum has. It's a pull system. Scrum is a pull system. They measure flow. In Scrum, we measure velocity. The thing that's missing from most software development is set-based concurrent engineering, where they build multiple versions of the same product, and then they decide on the best version, the best prototype version, and then only then will they implement. Apple does that. The first Scrum team does that. Most software teams don't do it. So a good Scrum is a lean Scrum. And Scrum is based on the PDCA cycle, which is what Toyota is based on. It's what Edwards Deming taught the Japanese. And in fact, at the senior management Toyota says, plan means to avoid Muri, or unreasonable behavior. So any manager that creates arbitrary days, put pressure on workers, makes people unhappy, that's a bad manager at Toyota. Okay? They're introducing Muri into the system. Doing means avoiding Mura. Mura is inconsistencies in flow. So any manager that is generating extra work and making people work weekends or nights is introducing inconsistencies in flow, and that's bad management. Check means to avoid muda, or find waste and outcomes. And Mary Poppendick and I have done lean workshops in the US and the United States, and what we find is that there is no one that has a process efficiency more than 15% for anything. So everybody has 85% waste in whatever you're doing at your work. This is a huge opportunity for Scrum Masters, because it's so easy to find things to fix that have huge impact once you understand lean. And at Toyota, the action indicates the will, motivation, and determination of the management to fix the company, okay, and eliminate waste from the system. So at the venture group, we train the management in lean. We tell them, you'll never understand Scrum unless you understand lean. And it's easier to teach them lean because they know General Motors went bankrupt. They know they could go bankrupt if a lean company was their competitor. So we teach them lean, and we show how Scrum is lean in software. Microsoft even uses Taiichi Ohno's taxonomy of waste. This book was written on their 3,000-person Scrum that makes all Microsoft Microsoft development tools, which are designed today to support Scrum. So you can just pull out all this information from Toyota and Lean, and then you'll know how to do Scrum. I just want to mention a few key things that drive extreme performance in Scrum. We have lots of teams that don't get extreme performance. We have lots of teams that can't even get Scrum to work. But we know exactly what the problem is. If you get done and you get your testing completed and your features are working at the end of the software and at the end of a sprint and they're bug-free, you will double the velocity of your production. It is guaranteed. In Boston, we give people money back for their training if that doesn't happen immediately if they do that. We've never had to give anybody any money back. As soon as you start doubling your throughput in software, that creates a lot of suction on the product backlog side. So it's really important to get your backlog ready, okay? And so Ken and I have updated the Scrum guide this summer. How many of you are doing Scrum in here? A lot of you, okay? So most of you probably read the latest version of the Scrum guide, and we've started to move ready. You know, it's in there in capital letters now. I want to get it as strong as the definition of done, a definition of ready. Why? Because if the backlog is really in a ready state, that means it's clear. The developers can implement it. It's small, it's estimable, it's testable. Developers can implement it without being confused or having to go back and forth with the product owner. The team will go twice as fast. Now you're going 4 times as fast. The best teams, though, go 8 to 10 times as fast. The way they do that is the way they run the daily meetings. So most of the daily meetings are dysfunctional, so we change the questions in the daily meeting in the latest Scrum guide to try to improve that, to get every person focused on the team, focused on the sprint goal, focused on helping each other in the daily meeting, and the same thing in the retrospective at the end. Process improvement gives you that third doubling. In fact, we know 3 ways to get every team hyperproductive. And we can do that consistently. You know, the first team was, Scrum team was like that, but when I went to work with a venture capitalist, they said, Jeff, you need to formalize how people do this. It needs to be written down so they know exactly step by step. So for many years, Scott Downey and I have worked together, and Scott has an approach he calls shock therapy. You have a very strong coach who moves in as Scrum Master, sets up the Scrum. Everybody does it's like a martial arts dojo. He says, you know, you guys are new to Scrum, you have no idea how to do Scrum. So here's how it works, do this. So for the first week, they're doing exactly what Scott is saying. Then if they start working a little better, he starts to back off. So okay, now, you know, start making your own choices. By the 3rd week, the team has doubled their velocity of production. He usually can let them go and really start self-organizing. By the 5th to 6th week, they're always up over 400, 500%. We wrote a paper on that. The problem is that most companies aren't disciplined enough to do that, and we don't have really good coaches that can move in and make that happen. So we can't implement it everywhere. So we looked at another approach. Worked with a systematic software engineering in Denmark. This is a CMI level 5 company. Very high process maturity, probably the best data in the world on Scrum. They found out that if they could turn around a bug, if they could fix any bug identified in less than a day, all teams in the company would double performance, and they could bid every project at half price. They then went to the ready state. I said, look at the ready state, and they figured out exactly how to create a checklist for ready, and when people followed that checklist, they doubled again, 400%. They can do it every time. So we've tried to implement that in a lot of places, but the problem is most people aren't as disciplined as systematic. You know, CMI level 5, you know, your waterfall projects have to be virtually perfect or you can't get appraised at level 5. And to make a waterfall project perfect, on time, on budget every time, you have to be extremely disciplined. So most people aren't disciplined enough. So we've been looking at, okay, what could we do that just the average team could try out? And they could make this work. So the best approach I've seen has evolved because 2 of the leaders of the software patterns movement, Jim Copley and Neil Harrison, who wrote many of the software design patterns, organizational patterns over the last 20 years, they said we should have a Scrum patterns group. It'll be a subgroup of the larger patterns organization, and we should come up with patterns that make Scrum work really well. So we said, what are the patterns that would enable teams to be hyper-productive? And so we began working on that. And we have now a set of 8 patterns. The paper's been published. We did a big presentation on this at the Agile conference. And they all key off something we learned at OpenView Venture Partners. After running many hundreds of sprints, the investors looked at the data and they found teams that finish early accelerate faster. They said that is really interesting from an investor's point of view, because we always want to jam too much into a sprint, but that will make them late. And if they're late, they stay stuck, they're flatlined. So we can't do that. It's really not about velocity, it's about acceleration. So we need to coach them not to take too much, go slower in order to go faster. Okay, this was a really counterintuitive finding. So then we said, okay, well that's really interesting. What would make people not take too much in? Well, there's been a pattern around even since before Scrum called yesterday's weather, usually the average of the last several sprints. That is the best predictor of what you can bring into a sprint. If you just use that, your sprint planning gets cut in half. You don't figure out what you should bring in. You just bring in whatever worked previously. That gets the team started. But then what happens? Then they run into other problems. Okay, so these patterns address systematically every major thing that stops the team from finishing the sprint early, because we want them to finish early to accelerate faster. So there's a swarming pattern. We already know that multitasking creates huge amounts of waste. If you have teams working on 4 projects at once, 60% of the production will be lost due to switching. So how many people have teams working on more than one project at the same time? Yeah, everybody, right? No. We have some agile people in here. A few agile people. Now, sometimes you have to deliver multiple things in a similar time period, but good teams will start to serialize that to avoid the context switching. So there's a pattern on swarming. How do you get swarming going? If you can get people swarming, they still have the problem with interrupts. Things come into the sprint that were not planned. A customer has a big problem. It has to be fixed right away. Has anybody ever run a sprint without being interrupted?
I don't run sprint.
You don't run sprints, so you don't have that problem. Can you run anything without being interrupted?
Sometimes.
Occasionally, okay. But most of the time, you're interrupted. There's a study that was reported on in the New York Times earlier this year on the research at Carnegie Mellon that shows if you take a team that plans for interruptions and compare them to a team that doesn't plan for interruptions, even if there are no interruptions, the team that is ready for interruptions does 49% better. So there's a huge psychological, it's like a sports team. As a sports team, you're always worried about what's going to happen. You're always looking, you're always checking. So when something happens, you can immediately switch into a different mode of operation to deal with the problem. Software teams that function like that do 49% better. So in many companies, we implement the interrupt pattern. In fact, I would never run a Scrum today without the interrupt pattern if I was sprinting, even if I was doing a continuous deployment, which the best companies do today. I would have a way to deal with these interruptions. But in a typical sprint, what we want people to do is create a buffer. What percent of the time do you usually get interrupted? We want to put the product owner in front of that buffer. Anything that comes in, the product owner prioritizes. Some of it's low priority. Some of it's important but can be done later, the next sprint. Some of it needs to be done immediately. Then we insert this rule. If that buffer overflows, the sprint needs to be aborted, replanned, and management needs to be alerted that the release date or the delivery date of whatever they're working on is going to be delayed. This pattern has the side effect that it causes the whole company to self-organize to prevent aborts. So there will almost never be any aborts, and that means the buffer will never fill up. That means there will always be space, and that means the team will tend to finish early with open buffer. So for a lot of these patterns, it's the side effects that are more important than the pattern itself. They're designed to have really interesting side effects that together make them all synergistically generate a high productive team. Another one that is as equally important is scrumming the scrum. I learned this from a lean executive in France. He came to a scrum course just to find out what was going on, and he was coaching me at every break. He says, "You've got to get the teams to scrum the scrum. They won't do well if they don't scrum the scrum." So I said, "What do you mean, scrum the scrum?" "Use scrum to make scrum better." "How do you do that?" "Put the Kaizen in the backlog." What's the Kaizen? The Kaizen is the top process improvement you identify in the retrospective. Put it in the sprint backlog for the next sprint with acceptance tests and review it like any other story. That's scrumming the scrum. If you do that, you will consistently get a growth in velocity. The slope of your velocity will go up and down, but on the average, you'll get a slope that's about 10%. So here's a team that started scrumming the scrum in sprint, I think it's sprint 84. So right about, you can see 91 there, just a little bit before 91. In the early phases, they had pretty significant jumps in velocity, but then there's 2 years of data. If you draw a line through that, the slope of that line is about 10%. So when we hire Scrum Masters now, we say, okay, one of the Scrum Master's roles is to improve performance of the team. This is what we expect. If you're not getting that, then you need help. We'll work with you. So, because Scrum is a disruptive technology, and we have teams that are really fast today. There's a company near my office. We're actually a customer. We're at Kendall Square in MIT area in a building with 400 startups. And this particular company started up in that building. Now they moved out because they're bigger. They do 170 releases a day on a slow day. On a fast day, they do almost 300 releases to production, live to production. Okay, so we have some really fast teams, and that causes major disruption in their market. And so what is happening in the U.S., it's not good enough to do Scrum anymore. Adobe came to us last year and they said, we've been doing Scrum for 6 years, but it's not good enough. We got an awful lot of Scrum butt, and our competitors are getting better, particularly the startups. They say, we buy up the startups as fast as we can, but we're afraid there'll be a Google out there that we can't buy. That's our biggest threat. And so that means we need to do Scrum really well. Number one, so we're faster. Number two, so we can hire good people. And so they retrained it. We went in, we retrained everybody, including the management. And the management was not, what do we need to know about Scrum? We already know about Scrum. What do we need to do to change the company? How do we change bonus structures? How do we change job descriptions? How do we change space? How do we change all our HR policies? We got the HR director sitting beside me, writing down everything we're saying. She's going to run out and execute it after the meeting. This is totally different than what's going on in Europe, I can tell you. I spent half of my time in Europe. It's not there yet here, except maybe in SAP. We'll talk about you later. But in the US, this is forcing a huge jump in implementation of Scrum. The analysts are saying waterfall is over. They're telling senior management, waterfall is over. Get rid of it immediately. You must get agile. You must have cross-functional teams. You must have a technical debt remediation program. You must have a usability discipline. Business wants iPhone and iPad-like apps on your IT platforms. If you don't get that, they're going to send all these apps to Poland, to the Scrum teams, okay? You won't have any IT anymore. That's what's going on in the United States. So it's basically change or die. And in the Congress, they passed a law a couple of years ago that all Department of Defense projects must be agile. So last year, I was asked by the head of DODIT to come to the Pentagon to work with the coordinating task force on their response to Congress. They had to tell the Congress how they were going to do it. So we're interested in finding the first contractor that gets sent to jail for not being agile. We're looking for that. So Scrum is not only moving into the government in the United States. I found out at the U.S. Post Office systems. I sat behind the program manager office, a director at a recent Scrum Alliance gathering. He said, we had trouble, kind of getting a Scrum adoption in the post office, so we just did what the DoD did. It's not optional. If you're not doing Scrum, you're no longer working at the post office. That's it. So Scrum is changing companies. It's shifting the whole structure of the way companies work. It breaks down the command and control structure, and the management needs to move into leadership. Instead of telling people what to do and micromanaging people, they have to lead people by giving them a vision, a direction, a goal, a challenge in a way that the people will rise to the challenge. Traditional management structures, when they implement Scrum, they keep the management structure the way it is, and then they implement these cross-functional Scrum teams. About 80% of those fail because some manager changes and then they disrupt the Scrum implementation. So people say, why are all these Scrum implementations failing? Scrum must be bad. No, management is bad. As soon as a manager that doesn't understand, or sometimes they'll even come in and ban Scrum. One of our major customers in Europe, they brought in a new CIO. He's a waterfall guy. He says, I don't like Scrum. We're going to get rid of it. These guys had a pretty good Scrum. They were delivering 2 or 3 times as much stuff, and it was a lot better stuff. But this new guy is going to go in and crush it. What happens then? In the US, all the best developers leave the company. The company's revenue starts going down, along with their market share. So there's a huge penalty for these failures. The ones that work, we find, companies like Salesforce and Spotify have the teams as the focus, and the pyramid tips on its slide. The managers become supporting the teams. So for example, a QA manager at Spotify makes sure that the testers they hire the right testers, they're all trained, they have the right tooling, but he has no responsibility for day-to-day management of the testers. The teams do that. So now when you change a QA manager, he can't say we're going back to waterfall. He has no authority to do that. So now you get a more stable Scrum implementation. So many of the companies in the US are moving in that direction, and some big companies, really big companies, are moving that way also. So for example, SAP is a good example. They have almost 1,000 Scrum teams. And they said, you know, we have hundreds and hundreds of managers, but the product still sucks. So clearly it's not working. So we're going to take 2/3 of the managers and we're going to make you product owners. You can manage each other and the backlog, but you have no management control over engineers. That's over. They took 1/3 of the managers left. They said, we do need some people that help with hiring, motivating, training. And so we'll give each one of you 100 developers, so you can't possibly manage them day to day, but you can worry about their career paths. So SAP is already tipped, and they're the largest Scrum organization in the world that we know. We don't know of anybody that's doing more than 1,000 teams. Microsoft is in the process of tipping. They already had a really good Scrum of 3,000 people. I think I have a chart of, they started in 2005. They cut their 18 months releases down to much shorter by 2008. By 2012, they're now releasing at the end of every sprint, 3 weeks. But that wasn't good enough. Releasing at the end of every sprint is not good enough. And so Steve Ballmer said earlier this year, we need to go way faster. We need to completely reorganize the company. The management said, how much faster? How about more than 10 times as fast? And the manager said, well, how do we do that? And Steve said, ask the teams. So, and he said, also, I'm retiring. You guys are going to have to figure this out. So the technical leadership at Microsoft gave a really interesting presentation at the Big Agile conference in this summer in Nashville, and they said, our job is to convert 20,000, we've already got 3,000 Microsoft developers scrumming, but our job is to get the other 20,000 Agile, particularly the Windows guys. And for every dollar we spend on development in Windows, 85% of that dollars goes to technical debt management. Fixing bugs. Every time you make a change, you create more bugs. And the people are afraid of the code. They don't want to touch the code. So he says, our agenda is to radically change that. We're going to move them to the latest tooling, and actually most of Microsoft tooling is already designed to support Scrum. They all need to move to the latest tools and techniques. They need to be doing radical refactoring. If they have a problem, they need to dive into the guts of the code and they need to fix it. And our biggest problem is the really senior developers that don't know the new tools and techniques. All our new developers come out of university. They already know this. And we have to get them to train the senior guys. That's a big cultural problem. So Microsoft is changing. But the real interesting companies are those companies that just don't have any managers at all. Valve Corporation is a multi-billion-dollar gaming company. They said they hired a manager once from IBM, and they didn't like it, so they fired him after 3 months. They have no management. When you come into Valve Corporation, your job is to find something cool to build, convince other people to work with you to build it, and ship it. That's it. There are no committees that are going to oversee you, managers that are going to tell you what to do. It's all self-organizing. And we have other multi-billion-dollar companies, some of them written up in the Harvard Business Review, that aren't even software companies, that run with no management. So what is the future of Scrum? It's going to scale to thousands of teams. It is going to go to continuous deployment. Every time a developer touches a piece of code, it's going to go live in a few minutes, yeah. it's going to run the whole internet. Now, it's interesting because recently somebody told me, the guys in Paris, they said, Google's not doing Scrum anymore in Paris. What are they doing? They said, well, they all sit around a table together, they're all working together, and whenever anybody comes free, they go to the top item in the backlog and they take it and they immediately start working on it. And it doesn't matter if they know it. If they don't know it, they learn it. There's no toleration for somebody not doing something they don't know. Everybody immediately goes to the top. And if there's any impediment, that goes to the top of the backlog, and the first person free starts working on it. And I said, well, that's really interesting. They must be a really fast team. They said, yeah, really fast team. I said, that's a restate Scrum. It's what I wrote about back in 2005. I wrote a paper on the future of Scrum. The Scrum community said, that's not Scrum. It looks sort of like Kanban, this continuous deployment. But it doesn't look like a lot of Kanban teams, okay? In order to make a Kanban team run fast, you need a team. You can't have silos of people working. That doesn't work. You have to have a team. You need a team leader. You need somebody managing the backlog. And all of a sudden, starts looking like Scrum. So we're going to have Scrum running the entire enterprise. And it's going to be everywhere. We have companies that the managers run Scrum, the departments run Scrum, the engineers run Scrum. I work with companies where the engineers don't run a very good Scrum compared to the marketing group. One of our venture companies, the marketing group, is the best Scrum in the company. You have to use them to train the engineers because they're slow. It's becoming fundamental to operations way outside of software, in education, agriculture, government, and healthcare. The leading edge of Scrum today is in the Netherlands, where they have a school teaching with Scrum. The kids come in, the bell rings, the kids walk into the class. They're all in teams of 4. They immediately take out this paper Scrum board and paste it on the wall. They have their daily meeting. They sit down and they go to work. The teacher does nothing. Just answers questions. The teacher's like the product owner. So the product owner has already, given them the backlog for the sprint, and they're there to answer questions if they have questions about the backlog. I asked those kids, does Scrum make it easier to learn? They said, yes. I was in a room, one of the classes, I had like 30 kids. Yes. They all scream yes. Is it faster? Yes. Do you get better grades? Yes. Okay. On a scale of 1 to 10, the Scrum kids get 2 points higher on the average in grades, and they finish their work weeks earlier and get to work on special projects. The teachers say virtually all discipline problems have gone away, virtually all motivation problems go away. The kids say, we can't believe that adults do this. We thought it was designed for teenagers. So that's the future of Scrum, and your children will be teaching you how to do it better in the future.